My name is Emily Carter, I am 29 years old, and I was 7 months pregnant when my mother-in-law hit my stomach with an open hand and screamed that the baby had to belong to her daughter. Not to me. To her daughter. I didn't scream back. I didn't cry in front of them. I stepped back, one hand over my belly, and I said 4 words. You'll want to sit. They didn't understand yet. They thought I meant I needed a chair. I meant they did. Because 3 weeks earlier, a lawyer named David Bennett had already filed something in my name, something my late grandmother had arranged 11 years before this night, back when I was 18 years old and nobody else was paying attention to me. My mother-in-law, Diane, turned red and told me I was being dramatic. My father-in-law, Richard, told me to apologize to Vanessa, his daughter, my sister-in-law, the one who couldn't have children of her own and had decided, somewhere along the way, that mine would do instead. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back 11 years, to a small kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and wood polish, when my grandmother said something I didn't understand until the night my in-laws put their hands on my stomach. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Marsh, and her kitchen was the only place I ever felt entirely safe. I was 18. My parents had died 2 years earlier, a car accident on a road I still can't drive past, and I had gone to live with my father's mother in a narrow brick house at the end of Linden Street. The house smelled like cinnamon in the winter and cut grass in the summer, and the floor by the back door creaked in exactly the same spot every single time, so you always knew when someone was coming. Eleanor kept her hands busy. Kneading bread. Polishing the same wooden table until it shone amber under the kitchen light. I used to sit on the counter and watch her hands move, and I remember the texture of that table under my palms, worn smooth in the middle, rougher at the edges where the varnish had thinned with age. One evening, a lawyer came to the house. I didn't think much of it at the time. Eleanor had all kinds of visitors, church friends, old neighbors, a retired accountant who played cards with her on Thursdays. But this man wore a gray suit and carried a leather folder, and he stayed much longer than a card game would have. I remember the sound of the front door closing behind him, a soft click, and then Eleanor standing in the hallway for a long moment before she came back into the kitchen. She sat me down at that same worn table and said something I didn't understand for a decade. People will tell you love is something you feel, she said. But sometimes love is something you build quietly, years before anyone needs it. You don't announce it. You just make sure it's there. I nodded because I thought she meant something small, a savings account, maybe, or her wedding ring, tucked in a drawer for whichever grandchild married first. I had no idea what she'd actually done, or how far ahead she was already thinking. My in-laws, back then, weren't even in my life yet. I met my husband, Daniel, 2 years later, in a kind, ordinary way, a mutual friend's birthday, a shared umbrella in the rain outside a restaurant. By the time we married, Eleanor was already slowing down, smaller steps, longer naps, a walking stick she pretended she didn't need, propped by the door like it belonged to someone else. Diane and Richard were warm in front of other people. At family dinners, Diane complimented my cooking and asked about my job at the design firm, always with the same bright, practiced tone. There was a particular smell to their dining room, furniture polish and the candle Diane always lit before guests arrived. Something meant to smell like vanilla but landed closer to plastic. The table itself was glass, cold under my palms, nothing like Eleanor's warm, worn wood. But I noticed things. The way Richard talked about Vanessa's fertility treatments like a business problem that needed a business solution, laying out costs and timelines the way he'd discuss a home renovation. The way Diane's eyes moved to my stomach at every holiday dinner, long before I was even pregnant, like she was measuring something, calculating a date on a calendar only she could see. I didn't have proof of anything wrong. Just a feeling, the kind that sits behind your ribs and doesn't leave. Eleanor used to say that feeling was worth listening to. I filed it away and kept smiling at dinner, passing the bread, agreeing that the roast was lovely, the way you do when you don't yet have the power to do anything else. Eleanor visited us a handful of times before she passed, and I remember how the whole house seemed to soften around her, even Diane's glass table looking a little less cold with a pot of Eleanor's tea sitting on it. She never said anything critical about Richard or Diane out loud. She just watched, the same quiet way she watched everything, and once, on the drive home, she squeezed my hand and said, "You take care of yourself, Emily. Not everyone in a family is trying to take care of you." I laughed it off at the time. I didn't laugh it off later. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in March, 4 years ago, in the same brick house on Linden Street. I was the one who found her, still warm, a cup of tea gone cold on the worn kitchen table. At the funeral, Diane wore black and cried the correct amount in front of the correct people. 2 days later, at the reading of Eleanor's will, I watched her face change the moment she realized the house on Linden Street had already been sold years earlier, quietly. And the proceeds moved somewhere the family lawyer described only as a trust, established for Emily's benefit, terms confidential. Diane didn't ask what that meant. She asked how much. That was the moment I understood what Eleanor had tried to tell me at that kitchen table. Love, in this family, had a vocabulary, and Diane spoke it fluently. Trust. Asset. Beneficiary. Terms. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. I went back to Linden Street one last time before the new owners moved in. The house was already half empty, boxes stacked by the door, but the floor by the back door still creaked in the same spot. I stood there for a long moment, just listening to that small, familiar sound, before I locked the door behind me for the final time. 3 months after the funeral, I was in the hallway outside the kitchen at Daniel's parents' house, looking for a serving spoon, when I heard Richard's voice through the half-open door. "If Emily has a girl, it doesn't matter as much," he was saying. "But if it's a boy, a Carter boy, Vanessa needs to be the one raising him. She's the one who can't have her own. It would fix things. Make it look natural. We just need Emily to agree before the birth, while she's still soft about family." Diane's voice, lower. "She won't agree easily. She's not as soft as she looks." I stood very still in that hallway. I didn't drop the spoon. I didn't gasp. I went back into the dining room, sat down, and passed the potatoes when someone asked for them. I said nothing that night, or the next week, or the week after. I became very good at being underestimated. I let them believe I hadn't heard a thing, that I was still the quiet daughter-in-law who agreed with whatever kept the peace, who laughed at Richard's jokes and helped Diane clear the table without being asked. Meanwhile, I started keeping a small notebook, dates, comments, the specific things Richard and Diane said about arrangements, and what would be best for the family. I wrote them down at night, at my own kitchen table, in a plain notebook I kept at the bottom of a drawer, under a folded stack of dish towels where no one would think to look. I also started visiting Linden Street's old neighborhood on quiet Sunday afternoons, just to sit in my car near the house that used to be Eleanor's, though I never told anyone that either. It was the one place I still felt like myself, and not like something being discussed in a hallway. I didn't know yet what I would do with any of it. I only knew that being invisible to them had just become the most useful thing I had. It was in a box of Eleanor's old recipe cards, 6 months into my pregnancy, that I found the envelope. It had my name on it in her handwriting, tucked between a card for apple crumble and one for her Sunday pot roast, like she knew exactly where I'd eventually go looking and exactly how long it would take me to get there. Inside was a single folded letter and a business card for David Bennett, attorney at law. The letter said this: "Emily, if you're reading this, it means enough time has passed that you might be starting your own family, and I want you to know something before anyone else has the chance to make it complicated. I set up protections for you years ago, for you and for any children you have, because I watched how this family talks about children as things to be assigned, not people to be loved. Call David. He knows everything. Ask him about the trust, and about the guardianship provisions. You were never as unprotected as they think you are." I called David Bennett the next morning, the business card slightly soft at the corners from years sitting in that box. He asked me to come to his office instead of explaining it over the phone, and when I arrived, he had a thin folder already sitting on his desk, my name typed neatly on the tab. He explained it to me slowly. The way you'd explain something to someone still in shock. Eleanor hadn't just left me money. She had established an irrevocable trust for any future great-grandchildren, with a legal guardianship clause that named me, and only me, as the sole decision-maker for any minor beneficiary, specifically written to override any informal family arrangement not made through the court. She had drafted it with a family law attorney 11 years earlier, after watching, quietly, the way Richard and Diane treated Vanessa's fertility struggles as a resource problem to be solved using someone else's body. David told me Eleanor had come to his firm with a single question: how do you protect a child from a family that already sees children as things to be assigned? He said she'd asked it without raising her voice, the same way she asked about anything, calm, exact, already 3 steps ahead. She had seen this coming before I even understood what I was looking at. David walked me through the document page by page, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight in my chest ease slightly, like a held breath finally let out. 2 weeks later, I stood in that same hallway outside Diane and Richard's kitchen, and I heard them again, closer this time, more specific. A date. My due date. A plan to have the paperwork ready at the hospital, informal, family only, before Emily's too tired to think clearly. Richard said Vanessa's name 3 times. Diane said mine once, and only to describe what I would sign. I stood very still, my hand resting on the doorframe, the wood cool under my fingers, and I listened until I had every detail I needed. Then I walked back into the living room and asked, calmly, if anyone wanted more coffee. I texted David 2 words. It's confirmed. Mid-video engagement question: have you ever had to stay silent to protect yourself even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me in the comments. I read them. That night, I lay in bed next to Daniel, who still didn't fully understand what his own parents were planning, and I listened to him breathe, slow and even, while my mind stayed wide awake. I thought about Richard and Diane falling asleep in their house across town, the folder probably already sitting on the kitchen counter, believing they had a plan nobody could stop. I already knew the truth. They didn't. David walked me through it in plain language, at his office, over 2 cups of coffee that both went cold before we finished them. The trust meant that any attempt to informally transfer custody or guardianship of my child, verbal, written, or otherwise, outside of a proper court process would have no legal standing, and any pressure applied to obtain my signature under duress could be used against them. More than that, Eleanor's trust included a provision requiring formal legal review of any custody-adjacent document involving her great-grandchildren, meaning David would automatically be notified, and could intervene, the moment any family paperwork was drawn up. You don't need to fight them, David said. You just need to let them try, on record. He also explained the timeline. Once the birth certificate was filed, he would submit the guardianship confirmation the same day, which meant any competing document Richard and Diane produced afterward would already be too late, legally speaking, before they'd even finished printing it. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to turn. 2 days later, Diane showed up at my apartment with a gift bag, baby clothes, tiny and soft, the kind you buy to make a point. She sat on my couch and told me how hard this had all been for Vanessa, how a mother should understand another woman's pain, how family takes care of family. She said Vanessa would raise the baby, with all the love in the world, and that I could still see the child whenever it made sense. I looked at the little clothes in the bag and said, I'll think about it. Diane smiled like she'd already won, folding her hands in her lap, satisfied, already halfway out the door in her mind toward telling Richard the good news. That same week, Daniel's younger sister, Grace, still in college, pulled me aside at a gas station and asked, quietly, if everything was okay, because she'd heard her parents talking in a way that made her stomach hurt. Her voice shook a little when she said it, and I remember the wind pulling at her jacket while we stood by the pumps. I told her I was fine. I didn't tell her more than that. She was 17. She didn't need to carry what I was carrying. The night before my baby shower, I drove out to Linden Street alone. The house had new owners now, different curtains in the windows, a child's bicycle leaning against the porch that used to hold Eleanor's rocking chair, but I sat in my car outside it anyway, hand on my belly, and let myself cry, not from fear, but from something clearer than that. I wished Diane had been the kind of mother-in-law who would have knitted a blanket instead of drafting a claim. I wished Richard had once asked how I was feeling instead of what I was worth to the family. I wished Vanessa's pain had made her kinder instead of desperate. I wished, for just a moment, that none of this had to be handled with lawyers and trusts and locked doors. But wishes don't hold up in court. Eleanor's trust does. I sat there until the streetlights came on, then I drove home, wiped my face in the driveway, and walked inside to help Daniel set up chairs for a party I now knew was only half as innocent as it looked. It was 11:50 p.m., 4 days before my due date, when David called. The house was quiet in the way only a sleeping house can be, Daniel already asleep down the hall, the refrigerator humming faintly in the kitchen, the streetlight outside throwing a thin orange line across the floor. I sat alone at my kitchen table, a small, plain table, nothing like Eleanor's, but mine, and opened my laptop to the screen he'd sent. Everything was already drafted, the formal guardianship confirmation, the notice that would be filed the moment any informal family document appeared, the legal record establishing, beyond any argument, that I was and would remain my child's sole legal guardian. "You don't have to do this tonight," David said, his voice calm through the phone, the kind of calm that comes from having done this before. "But if you want it locked in before the birth, this is the window." I looked at my belly, at the small movement under my hand, and I thought about Eleanor's kitchen table, and the way she'd said love was something you build quietly, years before anyone needs it. I understood, finally, completely, what she meant. I signed. "Congratulations," David said, quiet and warm, the way you'd say it to someone who just finished something much harder than paperwork. "It's done. Nothing they draw up will hold." The clock on my laptop read 12:03 a.m. I am 29 years old. I am, as of that exact minute, my daughter's legally unshakable guardian. And across town, in a house with a spare nursery already decorated in Vanessa's favorite colors, Richard was printing out a document he thought would make everything official. He'd find out in about 31 hours exactly how useless it was. My daughter was born on a Thursday, just after sunrise, and I named her Eleanor. Diane and Richard came to the hospital that afternoon with the folder tucked under Richard's arm like it was nothing unusual at all. Richard pulled me aside in the hallway outside my room, folder in hand, and said it was time to make things official, for everyone's peace of mind. He slid the papers toward me and asked me to sign in front of him and Vanessa. I sat alone at my kitchen table, a small, plain table, nothing like Eleanor's, but mine, and opened my laptop to the screen he'd sent. Everything was already drafted, the formal guardianship confirmation, the notice that would be filed the moment any informal family document appeared, the legal record establishing, beyond any argument, that I was and would remain my child's sole legal guardian. "You don't have to do this tonight," David said, his voice calm through the phone, the kind of calm that comes from having done this before. "But if you want it locked in before the birth, this is the window." I looked at my belly, at the small movement under my hand, and I thought about Eleanor's kitchen table, and the way she'd said love was something you build quietly, years before anyone needs it. I understood, finally, completely, what she meant. I signed. "Congratulations," David said, quiet and warm, the way you'd say it to someone who just finished something much harder than paperwork. "It's done. Nothing they draw up will hold." The clock on my laptop read 12:03 a.m. I am 29 years old. I am, as of that exact minute, my daughter's legally unshakable guardian. And across town, in a house with a spare nursery already decorated in Vanessa's favorite colors, Richard was printing out a document he thought would make everything official. He'd find out in about 31 hours exactly how useless it was. My daughter was born on a Thursday, just after sunrise, and I named her Eleanor. Diane and Richard came to the hospital that afternoon with the folder tucked under Richard's arm like it was nothing unusual at all. Richard pulled me aside in the hallway outside my room, folder in hand, and said it was time to make things official, for everyone's peace of mind. He slid the papers toward me and asked me to sign in front of him and Vanessa. Mostly just to say hello, and once a year, on Eleanor's birthday, he sends a card with nothing in it but her name. As for me, I still have the notebook, the one with the dates and the overheard conversations, tucked in a drawer I never open anymore. I don't need it. I have my daughter, little Eleanor, and I have the version of Eleanor's kitchen table I rebuilt in my own home, the same amber color, worn smooth in the middle just like hers. I think about Eleanor every time I sit at that table with my daughter on my lap. And I think, some people protect you loudly, in the moment. Others protect you quietly, years before you even know you'll need it. If you've ever had to stay silent to protect yourself even when every part of you wanted to speak up, tell me in the comments. I read them. And if this story moved you, subscribe. There are more to come.